Out of all 20 Primarchs, Perturabo is the one who makes the least sense as a chaos traitor. Fulgrim wanted perfection, and Slaanesh offered it. During the Laeran compliance campaign, Fulgrim recovered a weapon known as the Blade of the Laer, a blade that housed a greater demon of Slaanesh, which immediately began whispering to him. The blade didn't create Fulgrim's obsession with excellence. It found that obsession already there, fully formed, and fed it until it consumed him. The mechanism is almost surgical. One pre-existing desire, one precisely calibrated object. The conversion vector is visible, documentable, clean. Lorgar needed a god to worship, and the Chaos gods were delighted to receive him. His homeworld Colchis was already dominated by a theocratic faith whose priests, including Cor Pharon, who would become Lorgar's most trusted advisor, had been serving the Chaos gods long before Lorgar ever left the planet. The theological hunger was Lorgar's birthright. When the Emperor destroyed Monarchia, the model city Lorgar had built as a monument to religious devotion, and publicly humiliated the word-bearers for their worship, that hunger lost its object. Erebus and Cor Pharon didn't manufacture the need, they redirected it. There was nothing to construct, only a river that had temporarily lost its course. Angron arrived pre-broken. The butcher's nails, cortical implants of Nucerian origin, designed for gladiator slaves, were already inside his skull before the Emperor found him on Nuceria. They had remapped his brain, interfacing directly with his nervous system, suppressing higher cognitive function and inducing compulsive aggression. An Archmagos examination concluded that the nails were so integrated into Angron's biology that removing them would likely kill him. Chaos didn't need to build a trap for Angron. The trap was already in place. They just needed him to keep walking. Mortarion spent his entire life hating everything Chaos represents. He grew up on Barbarous under the rule of necromantic Xenos overlords and defined himself by his contempt for warp sorcery and supernatural power. His fall followed a specific sequence. Typhon, his first captain, betrayed the Death Guard fleet into a warp trap. A devastating plague, the Destroyer Plague, spread through the entire fleet. Mortarion watched his legion die around him, and, at the point of total collapse, made a specific, identifiable act of supplication to Nurgle. The irony that the man who hated supernatural power became the most supernaturally corrupted of all the demon Primarchs is documented everywhere. It doesn't change the mechanism. Chaos found the one situation where Mortarion's lifelong hatred couldn't protect him, and applied the precise pressure his psychology couldn't absorb. Perturabo has none of these entry points. No spiritual hunger reaching for a god. No weapon whispering in his ear. No pre-existing neurological damage that Chaos could direct. His canonical characterization, built across Guy Haley's The Hammer of Olympia and Graham McNeil's Angel Exterminatus, presents a mind that viewed Chaos instrumentally, a tool, not a faith. A resource to be used, not a power to be served. Where Lorgar worshipped, Perturabo calculated. Where Fulgrim sought transcendence, Perturabo sought proof. The Lexicanum's own summary states it plainly. He had a natural affinity for technology and cold logic, but lacked the strength of faith. No faith, no wound, no artifact, no obvious entry point. He was the greatest military engineer in the history of humanity. He understood systems at a level that exceeded every other being in the galaxy, except possibly the Emperor himself. He understood how structures fail, how logical chains break down, how rational calculation becomes madness when an enemy operates through corruption rather than reason. By every principle of his character, he should have been the last Primarch to fall to an enemy that operates through exactly those mechanisms. The question, then, isn't simply why he fell. It's what Chaos needed him for, and what it had to construct to acquire a Primarch who would have refused any direct offer on principle. To understand what made Perturabo acquirable at all, you have to understand what the Emperor's project did to him over 2 centuries of the Great Crusade. The Iron Warriors are described across their canonical sources as the battering ram of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's primary siege breakers. For solar decades, they were the force assigned to tear down enemy fortifications, not to build, not to construct, but to consume. The campaigns weren't prestigious. They were grinding, attritional, and largely invisible. No triumphal processions followed a successful siege of a forgotten Xenos fortification on a world whose name wouldn't appear in any crusade history. The cost was borne by the Legion. The recognition went into the general account. As those campaigns accumulated, small numbers of Iron Warriors were routinely detached to hold the outposts they had taken, garrisoning positions across dozens of star systems, fragmenting the Legion into pieces scattered across the galaxy. Perturabo resented this deeply, and the resentment was rational. He had been given a legion of extraordinary combat engineers and was being used to bleed them into position, leave fragments behind, advance to the next siege. The legions that followed in the Iron Warrior's wake benefited from the breaches his men had carved through enemy defenses. Perturabo received the casualty reports. Rogel Dorn held the title Praetorian of Terra. After the Ulanor Crusade, he was given the honor of fortifying the Imperial Palace, the single most prestigious fortification assignment in the Imperium, visible to every Primarch who walked its corridors, admired by every military mind in the Emperor's service. Horus Heresy sources describe the rivalry between Dorn and Perturabo as the most marked exception to Primarch collegiality. It was a rivalry rooted not in a single incident, but in the structural reality of how both men were used. 2 Primarchs with comparable mastery in siegecraft, assigned to opposite functions, one building the seat of empire, the other consuming the empire's enemies at distance. Dorn's work was the heart of the project. Perturabo's work was what made the project possible and was never described in those terms. There is no record where the Emperor explicitly praised Dorn's fortifications while slighting Perturabo by name. The disparity doesn't require that explicit statement. It was structural, embedded in assignment, in visibility, in the difference between work that stands and work that disappears. When Dorn fortified the Imperial Palace, the result was permanent. Every visitor to Terra saw it. When Perturabo demolished an enemy citadel, the result was rubble. Nothing remained to indicate who had done it or what it had cost. That structural disparity is load-bearing for understanding everything that follows. Perturabo's bitterness wasn't irrational. It was the specific fury of a man who had been doing the hardest work for the longest time, watching someone else receive the recognition for a different kind of fortification work. What accumulated over 2 centuries of deployment patterns wasn't a single detonation point. It was a pressure that never found adequate release. Then came the Soctrata Deeps, the campaign against the Hrud, an alien species whose presence physically distorts temporal reality, aging anything nearby, was ordered by the War Council. Perturabo considered it strategically useless. He committed anyway. He always committed. That was the problem. The Hrud's temporal shockwaves devastated his fleet. His legion took heavy casualties fighting an enemy whose weapons aged his warriors to dust where they stood, turning centuries of transhuman engineering into nothing in seconds. At the campaign's conclusion, standing over the wreckage of ships and the bodies of sons lost for a region he had never believed mattered, he could only attribute the damage to the Emperor's vanity. That is the word the lexicanum preserves from its sources. Not miscalculation, not strategic necessity, vanity. The legion's cost had been real. The justification had been the emperor's indulgence. Then Olympia revolted. His home world, the planet where he had been discovered, where he had spent his youth reshaping the political landscape of warring city-states through sheer engineering brilliance, rebelled while he was away. Damachos, the man who had found him wandering the mountains below Lokos and brought him in, had died. Without Perturabo's presence, the old feuding resumed. He returned and issued an ultimatum: enact decimation, kill 1 in 10 of their own, or face extermination and enslavement. Many refused. He went through Olympia city by city. 5 million Olympians were killed. The surviving population was enslaved. The Iron Warriors who refused to participate in the genocide suffered the same fate as their victims. Storming Lokos's palace in the campaign's closing stages, Perturabo found his foster sister Caliphone, the one person among all the Olympians he had ever genuinely trusted, and they argued. The argument was about his psychology, delivered in the direct language of someone who had known him since childhood and had no reason left to soften anything. Guy Haley renders the exchange in The Hammer of Olympia as one of the defining moments of the character. She told him he did everything the most difficult way and in the most painful manner, that he cultivated a martyr's complex, that he lurched from person to person holding out his bleeding wrists so they would see how he hurt himself, that he brooded in the shadows when all he wanted was to scream, "Look at me." He killed her in the middle of that argument. Then he stood in the ashes of the world he had just destroyed and understood that the emperor could never forgive him for what he had done. Horus, watching all of it, commended the decision. After the drop site massacre, he presented Perturabo with a hammer named Forge Breaker, previously the possession of Ferrus Manus, the gesture loaded with symbolism, the gift understood by both parties as the sealing of a pact. Horus offered what the emperor never had: acknowledgement. Perturabo swore his oath of loyalty to the War Master. None of this was manufactured by chaos. The Hrud campaign was a real order from a real war council. The garrison assignments were real operational decisions, not a coordinated plot to isolate him. The Dorn rivalry was a structural product of the emperor's use of both men, not an engineered provocation. Olympia was Perturabo's own act, produced by the damage the emperor's project had accumulated and never addressed. Chaos didn't build the wound. It found it, fully formed, running on centuries of fuel. And alongside that wound, catalogued with everything else, was one more detail. The specific nerve the emperor had exposed and never healed wasn't rage or worship impulse or physical damage. It was the need for proof of his own worth. The one question his precisely rational mind couldn't calculate past, because the calculation required external evidence he had never been given. That nerve had a specific shape: the unresolved question of whether he or Rogel Dorn was the superior siege mind. Everything else Perturabo could reason his way through. This one he couldn't. Because Dorn had never faced him in conditions Perturabo controlled. The rivalry had never been settled. And an unsettled question, in a mind like Perturabo's, isn't something that can simply be set aside. The inner sanctum of Perturabo's flagship, as described in canonical lore, contained drawing desks bearing architectural plans for grand pavilions, magnificent amphitheaters, complex industrial infrastructure, vast hive cities, impregnable citadels, plans for a galaxy at peace, for structures that would exist to house civilization rather than to kill it.
Alongside them, hundreds of delicately wrought machines and trinkets of such fine construction it seemed impossible that a being his size had made them. A golden lion crafted for Lion L. Johnson, a bronze horse designed as a centerpiece for Nikia, a celestial timepiece that Robute Gilliman mounted in the Temple of Correction on Macragge, a sextant built at Magnus the Red's request, with dimensions beyond the conventional. These weren't trophies. They were the record of a mind that built because building was its natural state, the way other beings breathed or slept or dreamed. The canonical description captures it precisely. Immense drawing desks bearing architectural plans for grand pavilions, magnificent amphitheaters, complex industrial infrastructures, vast hives of habitation, impregnable citadels, and ornate palaces to rival that of the most advanced engineering. He was the most technologically adept of all the Primarchs, not reputationally, canonically. The Lexicanum states it directly. He personally designed the Iron Circle, a cohort of Domitar-class battle automata from first principles, in the aftermath of a boarding action on his own flagship that had demonstrated his existing bodyguard was insufficient. His response wasn't to request better warriors, it was to design better machines from the foundations up. He designed and wore his own Terminator armor, the Logos, a unique and highly customized suit built to his own specifications, bearing features that referenced his homeworld of Olympia rather than the standard Astartes template. He wore armor he had made for himself because no artificer's standard interpretation of a Primarch's needs was adequate. The engineering mind isn't the vulnerability. The vulnerability is the gap between what that mind produced and what it received in return. The one direct quote the Lexicanum preserves from Perturabo as a header isn't a statement of military doctrine or a declaration of war. It's, "You don't know the things I dream. No one does. No one ever cared enough to find out." That is the psychological ledger in a single line, not what he was capable of, not what he had built, what had been seen, and what had not been. Every serious engagement with his characterization, Haley's novel, McNeil's novel, the Horus Heresy Legion's game's lore summary, community analysis built on those primary texts, converges on the same structural tension. He wanted to be a builder. He was deployed as a destroyer. He wanted recognition proportionate to work only he could do. He received garrison assignments and the expectation that he would continue to do it again. The Horus Heresy Legion's wiki states it without interpretation. When the Emperor found him, Perturabo was eager to join the Great Crusade, but he never felt he was truly valued by his father or his peers. That eagerness is important. He didn't enter with resentment. He arrived wanting to participate in something worthy of his capabilities. 2 centuries of deployment patterns converted that eagerness into something more specific and more dangerous than ordinary bitterness. The precise calculation of a mind that understood exactly what it was worth, had never been paid the equivalent, and was approaching the point where the outstanding debt required settlement. Chaos couldn't manufacture this vulnerability. It was too specific, too individually calibrated, too rooted in real centuries of real events to be something an external force had constructed.
What Chaos could do was wait for the moment when the debt had accumulated to a point where Perturabo would do anything to collect on it, and ensure that the only available currency was one that Chaos could accept. The moment came after the heresy had already cost him everything else. After the siege of Terra, after Horus's death, after Perturabo had withdrawn the Iron Warriors from the palace he had been besieging, furious at being denied what should have been his greatest triumph. after he had watched the traitor armies collapse and scattered into the eye of terror. After everything he had fought for had been extinguished. What remained was the one question the heresy had never answered: whether Rogel Dorn was his superior. 019 M31, The Great Scouring, Sebastus IV. The Lexicanum's Iron Cage article states it directly. Perturabo resolved to retaliate against his brother for dismantling the empire the Iron Warriors had built during the Great Crusade, and to demonstrate his superiority in siege, after the death of Horus denied him the opportunity to finish the destruction of the imperial palace's defenses. The substitute for that denied proof was what he built on Sebastus IV. The Eternal Fortress was a vast network of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire, tank traps, redoubts, and a system of complex underground tunnels running beneath the entire structure. At the center, a massive bunker designed specifically as a decoy, of no tactical value whatsoever. The entire structure was a teaching instrument about how Perturabo thought. Every approach was a lesson in what happened when you followed the obvious route. Every escape corridor was a kill zone he had already mapped. The trap wasn't primarily the Eternal Fortress itself. The trap was the assumption that there was something worth assaulting inside it. He needed Dorn to come to him. He needed Dorn specifically, not a surrogate, not a proxy victory against some lesser imperial commander, but Rogel Dorn himself, brought into terrain Perturabo had designed down to the last tripwire, surrounded by iron warriors who had built these fortifications and knew every tunnel junction and every covered approach. Only that confrontation, on his terms, in his architecture, could answer the question. Understanding Dorn's psychology well enough to construct the lure was itself a demonstration of what made Perturabo dangerous in ways that pure engineering skill didn't capture. Dorn had declared publicly that he would bring Perturabo back to Terra in an iron cage. The battle's name comes from that vow, made by Dorn's own mouth in response to learning the Eternal Fortress existed. Perturabo had anticipated the vow before it was spoken. He had built the trap before the bait needed to be laid, because he understood that Dorn's character would produce exactly that response to exactly that provocation. Dorn was also compromised in ways that made him susceptible. The heresy's cost sat on him. He was under pressure from Guilliman over the Codex Astartes dispute, the systematic division of the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters that Guilliman was insisting on and Dorn was resisting. Despite his brother Guilliman's attempts to dissuade him, Dorn launched the assault on Sebastus IV alone, and without the extensive preparation that characterized the Imperial Fist's best operations. He needed a defining victory. He needed to be the man who dragged a traitor Primarch back to justice. He needed proof of his own worth as the heresy's surviving loyalist siegemaster, and he was looking for it in the same psychological register as Perturabo. He found Perturabo's classroom instead. The assault opened with orbital bombardment, the straightforward approach, the tactic any commander would begin with, the one Perturabo had anticipated and rendered useless. The Iron Warriors sheltered in the underground tunnel network, emerged unscathed when the bombardment lifted, and then activated remote weapon silos positioned a significant distance away from the fortress. Those silos detonated in a massive explosion, hurling thousands of tons of debris into Sebastus IV's atmosphere. Communication between the Imperial Fist's ground forces and their fleet in orbit was severed. The ground forces were cut off from support and from any ability to coordinate withdrawal. Simultaneously, the Iron Warriors' fleet moved against the Loyalist ships in orbit. The two fleets were roughly matched in raw terms, but the boarding actions that followed weren't. The Imperial Fists had sent their Marines groundside. The Iron Warriors had prepared their Marines for ship-to-ship combat.
The Loyalist fleet was scattered. No support could reach the ground. No retreat could be coordinated. The Imperial fists on Sebastus IV were fighting in Perturabo's fortress with no lifeline to orbit and no way to communicate how badly things were going. The ground assault advanced into the Eternal Fortress in a massive formation, the front broad enough to occupy multiple defensive lines simultaneously. The kind of advance that makes sense when you expect to find resistance you can push through. The Iron Warriors met them with heavy defenses. Tank traps and minefields neutralized the armored elements and pinned the infantry. Then, as the Imperial fists broke through the initial lines, they encountered less resistance than expected. This was the trap's core mechanism, and it was beautiful in its brutality. Perturabo was deliberately withdrawing portions of his force. He was retreating, not because he was losing, but because retreating enticed the Imperial fists forward, into pursuit, into the prepared killing zones that lay deeper in the Eternal Fortress's architecture. Each withdrawal made Dorne's legion believe they were making progress. Each advance brought them further into terrain Perturabo controlled absolutely. He was overseeing it from a tower at the center of the fortress, watching the battlefield the way an engineer watches a mechanism performing its designed function. He controlled the movement of the Loyalists by controlling what resistance they encountered and where resistance disappeared. Company by company, then squad by squad, the Imperial Fist formation broke apart as they pursued what looked like a retreating enemy across ground that had been laid out to atomize them. As the battle ground on, the Imperial Fists were fighting largely battle brother by battle brother. The formation that had entered the Eternal Fortress no longer existed as a coordinated unit. What had been a broad advance became a dispersed collection of individual warriors, isolated in a maze of trenches and kill zones, each fighting their own personal battle with no visibility into the wider engagement, no way to coordinate a breakout, and no certainty about which direction led toward their brothers and which led toward another prepared position. The battle was prolonged and grinding. By the end, the Imperial Fists had expended their ammunition. They were fighting in half-flooded trenches with combat knives, using the bodies of their fallen battle brothers as cover. Dorne himself turned back multiple attacks and refused his captain's increasingly desperate pleas to organize a breakout and retreat. The Legion's captains genuinely believed they would die on Sebastus IV alongside their Primarch if he didn't order the withdrawal, and the Imperial Fists, ever loyal, had resigned themselves to that possibility. The Legion's character wouldn't permit them to leave while their Primarch chose to remain. Guilliman ended it. He brought an Ultramarines task force to Sebastus IV and drove off the Iron Warriors.
Perturabo, unable to defeat 2 legions combined, concentrated his final actions on denying the Imperial Fists the ability to withdraw in good order and collect their dead. A number of battle brothers were never recovered. The Lexicanum designates this battle's outcome, with the specific precision of an in-universe record keeper trying to apportion credit and blame. Mutual defeat. Neither side achieved its full objective. The Iron Warriors succeeded in inflicting the overwhelming casualties Perturabo had designed the fortress to produce, but failed to destroy the Imperial Fists entirely. Dorne survived. The source material on why Perturabo didn't finish the job conflicts. One account holds that he so relished the prolonged suffering that he didn't want it to end. Another holds that the Iron Warriors lacked the faith to sacrifice what total destruction would have required. Either way, Dorne walked away, injured, humiliated, his legion shattered, but alive, and rescued rather than defeated. What remained of the Imperial Fists was a hardened, veteran force, already reduced to Codex-compliant numbers.
Dorn accepted the Codex Astartes division of his legion into successor chapters: the Crimson Fists, Black Templars, Soul Drinkers, Fists Exemplar, and Excoriators among them. The Iron Cage had completed Guilliman's political work without Guilliman having to fight for it. Dorn had no legion large enough to resist division any longer. After the battle, the Iron Warriors forfeited the captured Imperial Fist's gene seed to the Chaos Gods. In exchange, Perturabo was elevated to Daemon Princehood. That is the canonical mechanism, documented in the Lexicanum's M31 timeline and consistent across multiple sources. A sacrifice of specifically identified material, then an elevation. Not gradual corruption, not spiritual awakening, not the kind of slow psychological dissolution that consumed Fulgrim, or the neurological destruction that had been dismantling Angron since before the heresy. A transaction. He gave something specific. He received something specific. The form is identical to how daemonhood has always functioned in this setting. Daemon princes are former mortal champions of chaos, elevated by the gods in exchange for their actions. Beings who have bartered their humanity for power and immortality. That framing appears consistently across the fandom wiki, the Lexicanum, and the Bell of Lost Souls background sections. It's the settled general mechanics. The specific application to Perturabo fits without modification. What requires a clearer accounting is the reading that frames the entire sequence as chaos's deliberate design. The Iron Cage as a trap constructed not by Perturabo for Dorn, but by chaos for Perturabo. No primary source states that the Chaos Gods engineered the Iron Cage as a pre-planned acquisition operation. No canonical text describes a moment where the ruinous powers identified the recognition wound in Perturabo's psychology and calculated that the Dorn rivalry could be leveraged into a specific sacrifice at a specific moment. The Iron Cage is canonical. The Daemonhood is canonical. The psychological mechanism that produced the campaign is canonical. What connects these as a deliberately designed transaction rather than a coincident sequence is an inference, consistent with everything the lore establishes about Perturabo's psychology and how daemonhood mechanics function, but an inference, not a statement in any Black Library novel or codex entry. What the canonical record does give you is structurally damning regardless of intent. A Primarch who would never have agreed to serve chaos chose instead to resolve the one question his psychology couldn't leave open. He built the eternal fortress to force a confrontation with Dorn on his own terms, in his own architecture, to produce what he needed the confrontation to produce. Proof that his engineering mind was superior.
The proof he obtained was ambiguous by any external measure. Dorn survived. The military outcome was a draw, and the victory required Guilliman's arrival to close. But from inside Perturabo's psychology, the lesson had been delivered. Dorn's legion had disintegrated in his killing grounds. Dorn himself had needed to be rescued. The proof existed, even if it would never be acknowledged by anyone outside the Iron Warriors. Chaos collected the cost of that proof before the smoke had cleared. Whether you read the sequence as deliberate engineering by the ruinous powers or as the natural mechanics of how a transaction closes, a champion performs the defining action, the gods accept the sacrifice, the elevation occurs. The structural result is identical. The most rational mind in the galaxy was outmaneuvered by an enemy that operates on principles rational minds are poorly equipped to account for. He chose something real and something specifically his, proof of his own worth. Chaos was positioned to collect the price of that choice because the price of that choice, in those specific circumstances,
happened to be exactly what the transaction required. The Long War isn't a rampage. That distinction is the key to understanding what the transaction at Sebastus IV delivered. Examine what the other Chaos Legions actually provide to the Long War's operational capacity. The World Eaters, under Angron's influence, provide overwhelming undirected aggression. They break lines. They create slaughter on a scale that breaks the psychology of enemy formations even before the physical destruction reaches them. What they don't provide is the capacity to manage a siege operation across multiple systems over the course of decades. The Butcher's nails don't produce staff officers. The same quality that makes Angron's Legion irreplaceable as a weapon makes them unworkable as a planning organization. Their contribution to the Long War is kinetic and immediate. They consume. They don't construct. The Emperor's children pursue sensory excess and the refinement of pain and pleasure to their absolute extremes. Their operational profile is defined by what Fulgrim sought: the peak experience, the perfect sensation, the furthest reach of cruelty or beauty. A force optimized for that objective doesn't maintain sustained logistical coherence. It doesn't establish forward operating bases and hold them against counterattack for months while the next phase of an operation is prepared. It hunts experiences, and when the immediate ones are exhausted, it moves to find new ones. The Word-Bearers conduct long-range theological campaigns, spreading the primordial truth, constructing warp rifts, converting populations to chaos. Their strategic planning capabilities are genuine, and their influence on the Long War through the Black Crusades is significant. But their objective is spiritual conquest. Their model is evangelical and expansive, not territorial and systematic. They don't hold ground through engineering. They transform it, which is a different operation entirely with different requirements. The Death Guard spread plague, highly effective attrition but bounded in application. Nurgle's gifts don't produce siege engineers. You can't plague a heavily fortified Imperial position into submission across a system-wide campaign that requires coordinating multiple grand companies, establishing munitions logistics, and adapting in real time to hardened defensive improvements made by an enemy that has had generations to perfect its fortifications. None of these operational profiles produces what the Iron Warriors actually do. Storm of Iron, Graham McNeil's 2002 novel set in the 990s of M41, documents a grand company of Iron Warriors conducting the siege of Hydra Caudatus, a sustained, methodically planned assault on a heavily fortified Imperial Forge world.
The campaign begins with a drop-pod assault to establish a bridgehead, then transitions to the systematic construction of trench networks, dug-in zigzagging saps toward the fortress walls, engineered to advance outside the range of the fortress's defensive guns while providing covered approaches for the assault troops. The Iron Warriors establish their own artillery batteries in coordinated sequence to destroy the fortress's gun positions and weaken the walls. They run counter-mine operations when Imperial fists respond with mines of their own. They lose ground. The fortress detonates Tor Christo and devastates an entire trench network. And they recover, dig a third trench network, adapt their approach, and continue. They breach multiple defensive lines over the course of a protracted campaign, absorbing significant casualties at every stage and pressing the advance. The warsmith commanding the operation ultimately consumes Imperial Fist's gene seed at the battle's conclusion to complete his own elevation to Demon Prince, an echo of Sebastus IV, 10,000 years later, in the same operational context and the same transactional framework. McNeil produced detailed maps of the Hydra Caudatus siege. The tactical and logistical specificity of the campaign is enough to map and follow as an actual military operation. That's not a rampage. That's engineering conducted by an organization that has maintained the institutional capacity for this kind of work across 10 millennia. Then there is the Infinite Citadel. Perturabo's current campaign, launched in the era Indomitus, is described in the Lexicanum as a plan to conquer the Imperium by launching a massive campaign of attrition, advancing to Terra world by world, while simultaneously expanding the Great Rift. He has come to view the entire Imperium as a single galactic fortress. The breach at Cadia in the 13th Black Crusade was the first crack in that fortress's outer walls. The Great Rift is his contravallation, a containment line that holds half the Imperium at bay while the advance proceeds through the other half. His method, an expanding ring of interlocking interstellar fortifications, entire worlds converted into fortress keeps, entire systems quarried to rubble to provide the building material. Defenses so vast they cross planetary surfaces and stretch into the warp itself. World by world, system by system, grinding toward Terra on a timeline that doesn't require urgency, because urgency isn't how sieges work. He has explicitly assessed Abaddon's approach as reckless, a headlong charge no different in its fundamental logic from Horus's assault on Terra, an advance that will overextend the Black Legion's supply lines and produce the same result. Perturabo sees no reason to rush. A good siege doesn't have to be confined to one planet. Slowly expanding the front line toward the heart of the Imperium is the goal, no matter how long it might take. No matter how long it might take. 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, building toward this in Medrengard's towers, hasn't diminished the patience. The patience is the point. The patience is what engineering requires that rage can't produce. The Iron Warriors across their long war characterizations are consistently described as among the most organized, functional, and focused of all renegade and traitor forces. That operational coherence flows from one source and can't be replicated by desire or plague or theological fervor. Managing war as a project, thinking not in battles but in campaigns, not in campaigns, but in strategic architectures that span decades and systems, and the lifetimes of the soldiers executing them, requires a specific cognitive capacity that isn't a product of chaos corruption. It was a capacity that existed before Sebastus IV, was refined over 2 centuries of the Great Crusade, and was acquired by chaos at the moment Perturabo forfeited the captured gene seed. Chaos can't create a Primarch-level military engineer.
It can corrupt what already exists and redirect what's already moving. The specific operational capacity to run a 10,000-year war as a coherent project at Primarch scale required someone who already possessed it. There was exactly one such being in the galaxy by the time of the Great Scouring. The gene seed surrendered at Sebastus IV bought the Long War its only structural backbone. The return on that investment has been compounding for 10,000 years. The argument that Perturabo never truly fell to chaos, that he retained psychological integrity in daemonhood, was never spiritually consumed, isn't undermined by anything the Iron Cage sequence establishes. These two readings illuminate each other. One explains how the transaction occurred. The other explains why it produced a demon Primarch who behaves unlike every other demon Primarch in the setting. The Iron Warriors in M41 actively amputate limbs when chaos mutation manifests in their ranks. They treat corruption as a malfunction to be excised, not a gift to be celebrated. An army of genuine chaos believers doesn't cut off the blessings of their gods. The posture toward chaos as a tool rather than a faith persists 10,000 years after Sebastus IV, embedded so deeply in the Legion's operational culture that it shapes their battlefield behavior in the 41st millennium. That institutional attitude toward corruption doesn't survive for 10 millennia if the Primarch at its head has been spiritually consumed. The culture reflects the architect. the bitterness. Every 40K era source attaches bitterness to Perturabo as the defining emotional register of his existence in Daemonhood. Not the ecstasy of Fulgrim, who lost himself in Slaanesh's gifts and hasn't looked back since, who became the serpentine demon creature at Idris and departed for parts unknown without apparent regret. Not the consuming rage of Angron, whose butcher's nails have been degrading what remained of him since before the heresy, and whose functioning as a strategic entity ended long ago. Bitterness is the emotional profile of a being who hasn't received what he came for, of a mind still running the calculation, still computing the gap between what it is worth and what it has been acknowledged to be worth. A genuinely converted chaos servant doesn't remain bitter. The conversion resolves the hunger, that is, the mechanism, the whole point of what Slaanesh offered Fulgrim and what Nurgle offered Mortarion. Perturabo's hunger wasn't resolved. It has been running on the same fuel for 10,000 years, and the Infinite Citadel, a systematic plan aimed at Terra, at the Emperor's seat, at the ultimate proof, is exactly what you would expect from a being who is still trying to collect on a debt that has never been paid. At the Siege of Terra, documented across the Lexicanum's account of those events, Perturabo was the only major traitor Primarch who had not fully fallen to chaos by the time the war ended. He watched the others become consumed, aloof, operationally unreliable. He was running the actual campaign, the data networks, the tactical coordination, the command decisions, while demon Primarchs proved increasingly useless as strategic assets. When Horus finally ordered him to disperse the Iron Warriors among various war zones and handed his command authority to Mortarion, Perturabo ordered the Iron Warriors to evacuate Terra entirely. He withdrew to the Iron Blood. He watched the final acts of the siege from orbit, watching the data streams, destroying everything within reach with Forgebreaker in a rage at being denied what should have been his greatest operational triumph. He was hating both sides equally by the time Horus died. That emotional position, contempt for his own faction equal to his contempt for the Imperium, isn't the position of a true believer.
It's the position of a man who used a war for his own purposes and is furious that the war ended before those purposes were served.
The transaction at Sebastus IV was the completion of something deferred since that withdrawal. He had survived the heresy without being consumed. He had watched his brothers fall entirely to the powers they served and had maintained the cold, instrumental distance he had always kept. And then, he gave up the captured gene seed and received what the sacrifice purchased, a form of existence that offers the one thing Daemonhood provides that nothing else does: time. Enough time to finish what he started, enough time to reach Terra without rushing. A being who was acquired rather than converted, who was outmaneuvered while looking at Dorn instead of at the mechanics of what he was building toward, would wake up as a demon prince carrying every grievance he arrived with, the recognition wound still open, the need for proof still running, no closer to resolution than he was when he stood in the ashes of Olympia and watched his foster sister's body cool. He would still be building, but now the building serves gods he doesn't worship, in a war whose terms he didn't negotiate, in a form of existence he entered through a transaction whose full cost he paid without having read all the terms. That is what the bitterness is. 10,000 years of compound interest on a debt he didn't know he was signing at Sebastus IV. Fulgrim found what he was looking for at the blade of the Laer. Lorgar found his gods through Erebus's guided pilgrimage. Angron arrived already carrying his destruction. Mortarion surrendered to save his legion. Perturabo went to Sebastus IV to prove he was right. He constructed a vast killing ground, The bunkers and tunnels, the interlocking fields of fire, the decoy at the center worth nothing to anyone who reached it, for a question that could have been answered in other ways but could only be answered definitively in a form that Dorn couldn't ignore and couldn't escape. He designed the lure around his target's psychology. He designed the terrain around his target's tactical training. He built the eternal fortress the way he built everything, with the understanding that every structure either works as its architect intended or it fails, and his didn't fail. At the end of it, with the Imperial fists shattered in his killing grounds and Dorn alive only because of Guilliman's intervention, Perturabo forfeited the captured gene seed and crossed from one kind of existence to another. The Iron Warriors are the most operationally coherent force in the Long War. Their sieges succeed at a rate no other Chaos faction can match. Their fortifications hold. Their logistics provide the Long War with the only systematic strategic architecture it has ever possessed. The Infinite Citadel, a decade-spanning, system-by-system advance on Terra, treating the entire Imperium as a single fortress to be breached through methodical attrition, is a campaign being prosecuted right now from Medrengard's towers by a 10,000-year-old demon Primarch who is still planning, still building, still approaching Terra with the patience of an engineer who has never stopped believing he will be proven right. The being behind all of it never walked into this with belief, or worship, or desire. He walked in looking for the proof that he was worth more than the Emperor had told him. Chaos collected the cost before he finished walking. The iron cage wasn't Perturabo's masterpiece. It was the last thing he ever built for himself. Subscribe for more analysis like this.